And even people who came over who did not know English eventually had to learn it. But the people who lived here never developed a common language. Therefore, they were never able to unite. And to be honest, I don't believe even Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan could have united them. Why not? Because number one, the area is divided by water. And again, Islam, now, yes, Islam did make a lot of headway here. Again, because the Islamic people became seagoing people. But eventually Islam made a lot of headway, but they were not able to unite them. Not only is the area divided by water, divided into several islands, but also inside the islands are steep, rugged mountains that are very, very difficult to cross. I mean, mountains that go straight up and are tall, hundreds of feet tall, and straight, almost straight up. And the type of mountain you cannot get an army to go across. Only expert climbers can make it across. And with an occasional gap in the mountains, maybe, but again, if all you have is one gap, and then if a defending army can stand in the gap and prevent the enemy from coming in. So this area was never able to be united by any one conqueror. The religion that eventually became dominant was Hinduism. Buddhism. It was Buddhism. I'm sorry, getting a few things mixed up. Buddhism became dominant. Hinduism tried. Now, initially these people were what you call animistic or nature worshippers. They believed that the tree was God, each animal was God, the sun was God, the river was God, nature itself was God. They were animistic, tribal, but they realized the superiority of Indian civilization, and they welcomed the Indian people in, both Hindu and Buddha, because animistic people tend to be egalitarian. That might be the reason why Buddhism became dominant over Hinduism. I mentioned how the American Indians had no social classes. Everyone was equal. They did have a chief of a tribe, maybe a medicine man or a shaman. Other than that, everybody was equal. No one was higher than another. But again, tribal peoples tend to be egalitarian, and Buddhism was egalitarian. So these people embraced Buddhism more than they did embrace Hinduism. Now, these people eventually, some of them formed states. You have a pattern that was to continue until the 20th century, where the people living along the coast became civilized, built cities, and then you get a little few miles inland from the coast, you get into the jungle. The people living there were tribal people, generally were not able to read or write, and they were tribal. Now, there was one exception. About 150 or so years ago, a European explorer was wandering around in what is today Cambodia, deep in the jungle, and all of a sudden, it was like the jungle just opened up and there appeared this huge city that was totally abandoned. A tiger looked at him from one of the buildings, looked out the window at him. A 6-foot-long black snake slithered across the street. He and the snake ignored each other. He looked and looked, spent some time looking around the city, got the exact location of it. Then he went out and told his fellow Europeans what he'd seen. Other Europeans went in. The name of the city turned out to be Angkor Wat. It turned out, the Cambodian people had told the Europeans for years that there was a city deep in the jungle that had been abandoned. And finally found it. And it turned out that Angkor Wat had been abandoned for some 400 years before this European found it. And they wondered, well, what was going on with Angkor Wat? All right. Angkor Wat was one of the most magnificent stone cities in the world, but here's the problem. Like so many of these ancient stone cities, the rocks began to crumble, the structure began to crumble, and it's very difficult to repair. All right, now, let's look at this classroom. What you see, if you look at the wall, is you don't actually see the block, you see the paint. if the block began to get chipped a little bit, and the paint's what, you get some painters in here, they put a new coat of paint down. Repair. If the wall begins to crumble a little bit, well, hey, if somebody punches a hole in the wall, you get a maintenance man in here and he'll put some plaster, well, not plaster, but he'll put something in the wall that will repair it and then sand it over really good and paint over it. You can never tell there was a hole there. But what if you have a stone structure and the stone one day just cracks right down the middle, and then another stone in the same building cracks right down the middle? Okay, that's difficult to repair. Now, before class, I was looking at a man who had restored, spent 18 years restoring, a 1956 Chevy, and that was 1956, 57 Chevy. I mean, a lot of people want to restore them because they were such good-looking cars. You can, but restoring a stone structure without, well, now for instance, now, getting back to this building, when this building becomes so old that its pipes become moldy and mildew and its wiring become, what they might do with it is simply get a wrecking ball in here and bulldoze it level and start from scratch and build another one. We can do that today. I mean, I've seen that done. I mean, I saw it done on UT. A building was really not all that old. They finally just took it down one day, built another one. But it's just, in the case of Angkor Wat, it was made of stone. The point I'm making was it had been very difficult to fix. Now, and eventually they had to abandon the city because the tribal peoples, the jungle people, the uncivilized neighbors were coming in and taking plunder and then disappearing into the jungle. The uncivilized people would again plunder, sneak in when nobody was expecting them, grab something and run real fast before the army had time to assemble and drive them off. Then the uncivilized people got to where they numbered more than the civilized people inside, and finally Angkor Wat was abandoned. Now, National Geographic did an article on them more than 30 years ago, that's when I first became aware that Angkor Wat existed. And they had something to say that I have not seen since. They said that their kings eventually abandoned Hinduism for Buddhism. Under Hinduism, the kings were energetic, forceful, conquering, let's go get them. Buddhism made them passive. Well, let's just meditate. Let's just accept what is, and whatever is the will of heaven, and we'll just accept it, and made them not try to reform or straighten up. And they blamed Buddhism for being the reason that Angkor Wat fell. Anyway, as is in the case of so many cities located in the jungle. By the way, speaking of cities in the jungle, you'll find a lot of cities in the jungle right in this region of the world here. We're finding when satellite imagery is showing up more than we can find because it's in the jungle now is so thick it's impossible for a human to get through it. But infrared technology and sonar and radar technology is showing a lot of abandoned areas right here in Central America, mostly Mayan. But anyway, Angkor Wat, they could get to it. The buildings there crumbling, decaying. It would take it would take a lot of effort to rebuild them. A group of people who may have been from China, the Thai, conquered them. That's where we get the word Thailand. I'm not going to write that down, but the Thai might have conquered them. Then came the Burmans. The Burmans eventually set up their own state. The civilized people, the highly advanced people living in Angkor Wat just felt like, we can't take this anymore. They built the city of Phnom Penh. Phnom Penh, and that city is still there after they'd abandoned Angkor Wat. A lot of time, people who live in these stone cities, Babylon was an example. When they realize the city is too crumbled to rebuild, they'll just simply abandon the city, go off and start a new city somewhere else several miles away. That's what the people of Angkor Wat did. In the case of Babylon, they built the city of Baghdad. All right. So much for chapter 9. Now I'm going to move on to chapter 10. let me see, before I proceed though, I want to just make sure. Okay. All right. My computer locked up on me, so I'm going to move on without it. Chapter 10, China. Oh, I may have mentioned this before, but you talk about the Chinese are the people who almost burst out of the seams and overspread the whole globe. Yes.
Didn't the opioid war kind of deter that?
Say again?
Didn't the opioid war kind of deter that?
Well, you're talking about the opioid war. You're talking about occurred in the 1800s. Yeah. we're stopping, but actually no. Before the opioid war, China had been on a state of, all right, they weren't declining so much as the rest of the world was just passing them up and leaving them behind. And the fault lay entirely with the Chinese themselves. The emperors are blamed, but actually the book says it was not so much the emperors, but it was their philosophers. I mean, they invented the inventions they made sure to put them on the top of the world. They had the rudder, they had movable sails, they had the wheelbarrow, they had the printing press, they had steel, porcelains, banking, paper money. Without paper money, you can't have a complex economy. Simply can't. And I think some of our early founding fathers were so hard against paper money, but without it, you simply cannot have a complex economy. They were underway. They got to California before Columbus got down here to the West Indies. But they keep in mind too, California is 10,000 miles from China. From Spain to West Indies is only about 4,000 miles away, so you can't, well, yes, you can blame them. The Chinese built 450-foot long wooden sailing vessels. I mean, that is huge, folk. But they built them and then let them rot. The banks, they closed them down. The paper money, they said, led to greed. And all told, one thing after another. But now, when the Chinese collapsed, well, the Chinese never fully collapsed. So we talked about the Chinese a couple weeks ago in connection with the Roman Empire. We compared the Han Dynasty China to the Roman Empire. And in the case of both Han Dynasty China and Rome, the population went up and then went down. And folk, it looks like that the problem was climate change and cooling. I just got to say this about the cooling. It's so obvious to anyone who has studied history that the climate of the planet has gone up and down and up and down, but now our experts are saying it's only going to go up and never go back down again. And we're eventually going to heat ourselves into a thermal runaway and greenhouse like the planet Venus. I'd like to remind them, we once had the planet, well, not the planet Venus, but we once had a worldwide tropical climate where even the North and South Pole had a tropical climate during the Cretaceous period. And guess what? It ended, it cooled down. What we're living in now is not as hot as it's ever been, folk. It's hardly even hot compared to what it has been. But anyway, China then went through a period of time called the Era of Six Dynasties. Era of Six Dynasties, where that nobody has said, they went through an era of disunity. Now, if you've looked at my article or on comparative history, Europe was for one time only united on the days of the Roman Empire, but when at least the civilized part of Europe was united. Then it fragmented. These people fragmented. These people were fragmented. These people were fragmented. India could not unite itself. I mean, it had big nations, but could not unite itself. China is the one place that has remained united through most. You notice I said most of its history, not all. Now, I really think that turns out to be part of China's problem. This is just me thinking, it's not something to read in a book, but if China had been divided into 50 different countries, one of them might have found a way, the way to what? The way to technology, the way to airplanes and radios, and but as it was, this divided area here, a few people here and there, particularly the British and the French and the Germans, were able to lead the way. But what if all of Europe had been united? I think that the rest of Europe would have pulled these more advanced countries down. That unity might be the worst enemy you can have. Now, again, this is a hot topic now because there are people saying that we should not build walls but build bridges and let all kinds of people in, including people who will vote themselves to bits in our public places. Let them in. Maybe you feel that way also. But the world has advanced through a small groups of people or allow themselves to advance, while the rest of the world remained in a state of decline. Small groups who isolate themselves from the rest. Well, maybe not isolate, who did not have a bunch of people pull them down. Now, right now, I mean, Great Britain is about to leave the European Union. It's called Brexit. Great Britain felt like it was being pulled down or being united to the rest of Europe. And for that matter, so does Germany and so do a lot of people in France. Because places like Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal and Ireland, their economies are pulling down the rest of the economies of Europe, and this is going on right at this minute. So when I say China was united, that might have been part of China's problem, not the solution to the problem. Anyway, each of you can do your own speculating. All right, anyway, now, China's history revolves around its dynasties. During this time, there was a time of disunity. Then they were finally united by a dynasty called the Sui. The Sui dynasty only lasted a few generations, but they became a powerful dynasty in China. They united the Chinese. All right, the Sui united the Chinese, and China was prospering for a while. The Sui dynasty gave way to another dynasty called the Tang. Now, the Tang. All right, now the Chinese tend to look back with envy at they look back, I mean, okay, for those of us who are Americans, we do have a history, but it's short, and we look back to, but we think of the days that this time we're living in is the best time there was. If you had been born in China, you look back on the great days of the Han Dynasty, way back yonder, when they had so much on the ball. Or look back to the days of the Tang Dynasty, when China was powerful. And they would look back to these times as being times of, great times of wonder. Times when China was great. Now, with the Tang Dynasty, though, you run into a phenomenon that was to eventually bring the Chinese down. And folk, hold on to your seats. I'm supposed to say some shocking things. The Tang Dynasty and the Sung Dynasty that followed it, both dynasties were guilty of the foolishness of trying to help the poor. Folk, I want to emphasize, I've asked you to be looking at this throughout the semester. Helping the poor, don't get me wrong, it's a noble thing to do. Pulling money from your own personal wallet And giving to someone whose need is greater than yours, noble. But it's not noble when the government does it. Because that way the government can only get money by taking it from you at gunpoint. Taxes, basically. They only can raise money by taxes. Therefore, they have no business using tax money to help the poor. The Tang Dynasty did this. Anyway, under the Tang, under Tang, the Chinese were able to conquer Tibet. No, they greatly expanded their borders. They conquered Tibet. They conquered part of Vietnam for a while, which we'll talk about in the next hour. And they expanded greatly even into Manchuria. They did not conquer the Mongolians, maybe to their regret, but the Mongolians were not a united people to where they could conquer. Right. Now, well, yeah, one of the things that they did, they built the Grand Canal, and I must mention the Grand Canal is still in service. The Grand Canal joined the Yellow River to the Yangtze. And the Yellow River was China's big, and the Yangtze were two of China's big navigable rivers, and it enabled trade to go along between parts of China. And again, a canal is important because canals enable, well, you can take even a horse that's of below average strength, and with a canal, that horse can pull tons of weight. And the horse doesn't even have to be strong, just able to walk and carry a little bit of load. And it's not fast, but now the problem with canals though is in the wintertime they'll freeze up, and also they have to be continuously worked on because they silt up. They get mud in them and they have to be cleaned out. As recently as when I was a child, some American secretly took a video of Chinese crew. Basically what they do, the canal had silted up. So what they do, they get their shovels, and the men up front would shovel from the canal to the men behind. The men behind would shovel from them to the men behind them. And this way they kept on going, shoveling one line after another, hundreds of thousands of them shoveling, until they got the mud over the top of the hill. That way it would not slide back down into the canal. And they would an American took a picture of them, shoveling the mud from the canal back to the man behind them. And I guess sometimes the man behind them would get filled with mud when the man in the front got too enthused with his shovel. But anyway, they would clean out their canals by this method. So anyway, but the Grand Canal is still in service. Oh yeah, and China at this time also conquered Korea. Now, nobody has ever conquered Japan, except in fact Japan never lost a war to the United States, defeated them in 1945. But the Japanese would sometimes, well, they were ready. I mean, again, it was difficult to get a navy into Japan to conquer. And but now, you've come to the next dynasty, the Song dynasty. Song dynasty took over when the Tang dynasty became corrupt. Now, here's the sad story of the Song. Under them, they were prosperous. They promoted music, they promoted the arts, they wrote novels. I mean, the people of that time wrote novels, which is difficult to do except unless you have the printing press. But keep in mind, the Chinese had the printing press. And they were even more into helping the poor than were the Tang. In fact, I'd almost call them a socialistic dynasty. They did not seem to see a need for an army, so they were militarily weak. They lost Korea, they lost Tibet, and Tibet, by the way, is still a hot issue because a lot of people around the world feel like the Chinese ought to make Tibet free, but none of our presidents have dared suggest that to China. The Dalai Lama who's the leader of the Tibet people, and they want. There used to be a professor who would have free Tibet on his car, and that went on for a few years. I don't know if the professor changed cars or if he left here or whatever. I don't see that sign anymore, but it used to be a sign, free Tibet. But anyway, Tibet got its independence. They lost Vietnam. Basically, they became enclosed upon themselves, but yet they were prosperous. They took land from the rich and gave it to the poor. Redistribution. Basically, fundamentally socialistic. And then, Genghis Khan came in and destroyed the Song dynasty. He did not himself conquer all of China, he conquered much of it. Now, essentially the story of Genghis Khan, we're going to mention it now, of all the world's great conquerors, whether it be Julius Caesar, Cyrus the Great, Alexander the Great, all of them were born into wealth. I mean, Alexander the Great's father was the most powerful ruler in his part of the world. Cyrus the Great was the born king of Persia, even though he did spend some time among the shepherds, true. But the only one of them who really came from poverty was Genghis Khan. When Genghis Khan was 10 years old, his father was poisoned. His father was a leader of a small tribe, and all the men in the tribe said, we're not going to follow a 10-year-old boy. All of them left except for some women. Well, Genghis Khan learned how to manage women. Maybe that's what made him so great later. But anyway, he had this tribe of women, but then when he grew up, he killed his older brother. Now, he and Attila the Hun had this one thing in common. They were younger brothers, Attila was, and they both killed their older brothers. He made a treaty with a certain tribe, then made a treaty with another tribe, and then used these tribes to conquer a few more tribes, and eventually did what had not been done in at least 1,000 years. He got all of Mongolia united. Then they told him, listen, Genghis Khan, you can conquer China. We know you can. Well, Genghis Khan knew that China had millions of people, but he also knew that under the Song, the Chinese were militarily weak. But anyway, he finally got his army of 100,000 men, and they marched up and down the Great Wall. They put the Chinese to terror. But after a while, the Chinese became a place, they've been marching around this wall for weeks and nothing's happened. So finally, Genghis Khan noticed, hey, we're at a gate, there's not many men, not many Chinese soldiers inside the gate, so he had his men ram the gate open with a battering ram, and then the whole army of 100,000 men poured in through the gate and into China, and there was no stopping at that point. The Chinese general committed suicide. The fault really lay with the emperor's folk. Now, I've had a little discussion with people who said that nobody could have stopped Genghis Khan. My take on that is Genghis Khan was a human being like everybody else and could have been stopped. Keep in mind the Chinese had millions of people. They needed a super highly trained, skilled army that could have matched and equaled the army of Genghis Khan. Nevertheless, they didn't. Genghis Khan was able to rout them, put them to terror. Then Genghis Khan spread westward and left part of China unconquered. It was up to Genghis Khan's grandson to finish conquering China. The new dynasty that took over after the Song was the Yuan dynasty, otherwise known as the Mongol dynasty. Now, the most famous Mongol ruler was Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan. Kublai Khan is remembered for two things. Number one, during his reign, a family came from Italy. This was the Polo family. Maybe you heard about Marco Polo. Marco Polo went to China and went to the court of the great Kublai Khan and was highly impressed by Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan eventually let Marco Polo return back to Europe. Marco Polo wrote a book to influence Columbus to come to America himself. All right. Kublai Khan is also remembered as the man who sent a fleet to try to conquer Japan. This fleet encountered a storm. Now, this story reminds me somewhat of what happened many years later, generations later, when Spain sent a fleet to try to conquer England, a storm came up. Now, everybody know a sea storm is called a gale. Anyway, but in the case of this incident, the sea storm was called a kamikaze. Now, we run into this word again in the second semester. Does anybody know in what context? The kamikaze were
In Japan, they were pilots.
they were suicide pilots. They were the pilots that Japan put in these airplanes, and their job was to ram American ships. They